Welcome back. Today I want to talk about the nimbus or halo that you can see around many pictures of many saints. You may have noticed this before and you might have wondered, what is that all about? And then of course we just push it to the side and we listen to the message of the saint and it doesn't become as important. But interestingly enough, you may have already begun to feel what that is, what that halo or that nimbus is. And so I want to talk about it and how interesting it is and how important it is for the spiritual journey. So let's get into it. So here's a picture of Christ, and you can clearly see the halo around him. Now here's a picture of St. Francis, and again you see the halo, the nimbus around the brain. Now here's a picture of Buddha, and it's represented in a slightly different way with marbles on his skull. That's the same thing. It's showing this collection of energy around the brain. Very, very fascinating. And so what's so great and so fascinating about this is you may have already had an experience telling you about this nimbus, this radiance around the brain, and you didn't know it. And that's just amazing, isn't it? Now, I'm not suggesting to compare us with Christ or Buddha or St. Francis. I'm simply saying that if you've had some of these sensations, you're already on that path. And you've already experienced some of this effect in your own meditations. So what is that, Forrest? What are you talking about specifically that I already experienced? Now, in the Big Bliss training, I give a demonstration and an explanation of what I call the roll-up. Do you remember those old roller shades we all used to have? And you'd pull the shade down, and then you'd let it go, right? And it would wrap back up into itself and it'd go at the top. Well, that's a roller shade, right? That's one of those old, you pull it down and you let it go and it goes right back up and it goes. Well, fascinatingly enough, when the brain is not invested into the material world, that's what happens to our energy. And so you can feel that coming up the body. And we usually call this Kundalini. That's the newest terminology to try and describe this experience. But it's not the old school terminology. If we go all the way back to the beginnings of yoga, to the Bhagavad Gita and the Mahabharata, if we go all the way back there and we begin to digest the old school technology, we'll hear over and over again a different kind of language than the Kundalini language. So that's the old school language, the Bhagavad Gita language. And when you read the Diaries of Lahiri, that is the terminology that he uses predominantly. He uses the old school understanding. And so when he feels this sensation, he says, the prana has risen. The prana rose in my meditation and then this happened. The prana rose in my meditation and then this happened. And that's his diary about his meditations. He doesn't say the Kundalini, the Kundalini, the Kundalini. He doesn't use that terminology. So if you want to understand it, we have this old school terminology and the new school terminology, which is Kundalini. And I much prefer the old school terminology because the Kundalini terminology, they're very invested into energy. And it causes a problem. It causes a secondary attachment, which we don't need. We want to get into absorption. We want to get into samadhi. You don't need a secondary attachment to energy. There is a natural process here. We move away from the exterior world into the realm of energy, and from the realm of energy, we move into absorption. But in that transition, we don't want to get so caught up and invested in energy that it becomes our new home and our new source of attachment. So that's a pitfall. And I'm not the first one to warn about this pitfall. And it happened in myself, and so I know about it. I know about it firsthand. So that's why I much prefer the old school terminology from Lahiri Mahasaya, where he says the Prana Rose. As we clear out the limbic projections of the brain, that the negative content which keeps us caught up and attached and invested in the exterior world, as we clear that out through the process of heart rate variability and Om Japa, by doing that work, we release the investment in the exterior story. And we begin to notice automatically that the energy starts rising up. And you might feel it rise up into your heart. You might feel it rise up into your throat. You might feel it rise up into your medulla. And you might feel it rise up into your brain. And that energy coming up into your brain is what these old systems of Buddhism, Catholicism, Christianity, that's what they're trying to tell us about in that nimbus around the saint. They're telling us about the Prana Rose. And that's what we're seeing in the saint. His prana rose back to the brain. It fell back to its home in the brain. So I explain that a lot, and I give a demonstration of it with a friend of mine, a dear friend of mine. I give a demonstration of that so you can see it firsthand in the Big Bliss training. So it's really cool. I can't do all of that in a 10-minute video, but anyway, that's the Big Bliss training. That's part of it. That understanding of the roll-up, as I call it. Or we can go back to Larry Mashaya's language and say the Prana Rose beautifully. And so when you feel that, maybe you don't notice. It's a subtle thing. It's very possible it's happened to you, it's happening to you, and you don't notice it. In fact, I sat in front of a student and I described it to him and I said, this might have already happened to you and you didn't notice it. He says, no, I never experienced that. And his next words out of his mouth, he started describing exactly what I was trying to tell him. But when we try to communicate with language, we get a little mixed up sometimes. We don't quite grasp or understand these subtle things that we're trying to describe. And so he went right on to describe this experience of the energy rising up. Very fascinating. So, like I say, it may have happened to you and you didn't even notice it. But you might notice there's an increased pressure in the skull. You might feel a magnet at the spiritual eye, which is also described as Lahiri Mashaya's first knot, the experience of the first knot. So I've got a video on the 3 knots, and that's the experience of the first knot, and it will intensify during the second and the third knot. And so you might feel that drawing sensation. You might feel it on top of your skull. You might feel it to the back of your skull, which is described as the bindu. All of those are possible. You might feel it wonderfully in the medulla. And that's a really safe place to be. So if you feel it here, or you feel it here, or you feel it in the back, and it starts to bother you, you can gently imagine that you are drawing it back to the medulla. And it's a wonderful, wonderful place back there. You just kind of, can I just draw it back ever so gently back to the medulla? You don't want to lose it. You want to draw it back. And so now we're beginning to enter into the realm of integration, which I hope is a constant theme on this channel. Integration. We want to integrate that energy with ourselves. This can take a while. So when you're feeling that pressure in the skull or at the spiritual eye or at the top of the head, it can be very unbalancing. You're not used to it. It's not an energetic norm, so to speak. And so you have to take your time and integrate it. And what does that mean? Well, it means grounding. So I have a video on how to ground yourself. It's very important. It's a very, very important video. It's very simple, very stupid. You're going to look at it and go, this is so simple and stupid. And it's supposed to be, because it's supposed to do one thing. It's supposed to ground you. And it's very simple. We can use the rescue breath. And see if that doesn't help to kind of soften what's going on with this energy in the skull. But eventually, you begin to ground it into your being and into your life. When we take our spiritual concepts and we don't have to wear a shirt that says, I'm a spiritual person, or wear anything to signify that we are this, I'm trying to be this thing. We try and do all that because we're viewing our life and our spiritual life as two separate things. And we want those two things to come together. And we want them to overlap. So that when you see a beautiful sunset, you go, oh my goodness, this is my whole spiritual path right there. And when you hear somebody say something wise, or even your child say something wise, you go, oh my God, that's beautiful. That's so wise, and it's right there. It's right there in my life already. And when you begin to do that, you begin to ground these concepts and your whole spiritual path into your life, you begin that process of integration. That's a beautiful thing. And eventually, through that process, this energy in your skull, it becomes a little more normal and a little more balanced and a little more incorporated into your entire being, your entire system. I wish I knew all of this from the beginning, because it happened to me very, very strongly, and it kind of became a crisis for me, this overwhelming energy in my skull. And I couldn't even talk to my friends about anything. I was in a monastic community, and I couldn't talk to anybody about anything spiritual for more than 3 minutes without getting a huge headache. So it was really turning into a crisis. Now, Joan Harrigan, in one of her books, she mentions that there's a padma here in the front of the brain, in the prefrontal cortex. And if that opens up, it can be very overwhelming. And that sounds very interesting. It sounds kind of like what happened to me. And it took me years to be able to integrate that. So you see me now and you go, oh my God, Forrest is very grounded. And I hear that a lot. Forrest is very grounded in the way that he explains things. And I had to do that. It was a crisis for me. And I had to ground. I had to find a way to bring that spiritual energy and ground it. And so now it's a part of me, and I barely notice it. So that overwhelming power of the spiritual eye comes, and it's not overwhelming for me. It's integrated. So here's part of the story. I got a mind mirror. This was like 5 years ago. I got a mind mirror, and it's a wonderful technology. I love Anna Wise and Maxwell Cade. I put it on, and I got this huge spike. I got this huge spike of vibration right at 59 hertz. You'll see it there right in the center of the gamma brainwave. In pink, you'll see it. And I sent it in to the people who sold me the mind mirror. I sent in the picture. By the way, if you call Judith Pennington and you tell them you want to buy a mind mirror, mention my name and they will give you a discount. Okay, so remember that. So I sent them this picture and I said, look at that spike. And they said, oh, you have feedback in your computer. I thought, oh, okay. So I went back and I modified everything and I made sure that everything was kosher. Everything was right. Spike was there again. And I did it again. I went back and I made sure every connection was right. I stayed very far away. I took the equipment far away from the computer so there was no chance of feedback. And there the spike was again. And then I meditated again, and I didn't feel as much pressure at the spiritual eye, and the spike went down. And then I went back and I meditated again, and the pressure increased, and the spike increased and I'm like, oh, it's me. That maybe is what Joan Harrigan was talking about when that padma opens up in the prefrontal cortex. And so, but the thing is that with time, it integrates, and it's very worthwhile pursuing anything which is grounding and integrating. Anything, digging in your garden, going out and doing community service, mowing your lawn, planting flowers, grounding that spiritual energy in a way that puts us in touch with either our community or the earth around us, our property, our surroundings, our family. That integration is so important. So remember, when you feel that prana rise, you're on the threshold of what is pictured in those saints, the nimbus around the brain. As the energy naturally falls back towards the brain, we experience a little bit of what that saint is experiencing in meditation. We're on the cusp of that. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that beautiful? So I hope you loved this. If you did, be sure to hit that bell down below, and I will see all of you next time.